There's a kind of silence that doesn't communicate disinterest. It communicates a felt absence, and the human brain reacts to that absence with a force few men understand. Ignoring, when done the right way, is not coldness or a childish game. It is a psychological stimulus that shifts attention, triggers emotional alertness, and reorganizes internal priorities. The problem is that most people confuse ignoring with disappearing out of fear. And fear never generates attraction. What generates attraction is silence that comes from autonomy, not insecurity. Robert Cialdini explains that the brain reacts intensely to perceived loss and scarcity, not because it enjoys suffering, but because it was trained to protect what might vanish. When a man's attention disappears without drama, without explanation, and without chasing, something specific happens. Focus moves from outside to inside. The mind starts asking questions. The body enters a state of emotional alert. It isn't rational, it's automatic. Absence becomes a stimulus. When constant attention disappears, the female brain doesn't immediately interpret it as rejection. It interprets it as a pattern change, and every pattern change demands evaluation. That evaluation pulls mental energy, creates curiosity, and opens space for projection. It's not drama, it's neuroscience applied to attraction. The common man's mistake is believing continuous presence maintains interest. Predictable presence numbs, absence with value wakes. This video doesn't romanticize silence or sell empty tricks. Here you're going to understand what happens in her brain when your attention disappears, why desire can increase instead of dying, and most importantly, when ignoring destroys everything. Because there is a limit, there is context, and there is a type of man for whom this works, and another for whom it becomes immediate rejection. Science, not opinion. If you've ever felt that the more you try, the less you're valued, this is the breaking point. Not to learn to ignore women, but to understand the power of conscious withdrawal. The right silence doesn't push, it pulls. And when you understand why, the dynamic stops being an attempt and becomes a consequence. The first effect, her attention turns back to you. The common man believes constant attention is proof of interest and a guarantee of connection. He replies fast, always initiates, maintains continuous presence as if that will keep the bond warm. The problem is the brain doesn't value what is always available. It values what can be lost. When your attention becomes predictable, it stops being perceived as a resource. It becomes background noise. And desire doesn't grow in the background. It grows in contrast. The psychological concept is simple and ruthless. The brain prioritizes what is at risk of disappearing. When a man's attention vanishes after a peak of connection, the female emotional system enters recalibration mode. Something that was there is no longer there. Focus, which used to be scattered, concentrates. The mind returns to the last point of contact, trying to understand the change. Not for drama, but for emotional self-protection. The brain wants to recover what may be getting lost. The expectation break here dismantles an old myth. Absence generates more focus than predictable presence. Not because absence is magical, but because it interrupts a pattern. And every pattern interruption grabs attention. A study conducted by Harvard University in 2018 showed that loss of attention activates brain areas linked to social anxiety and the desire for reconnection. The body reacts before the mind forms an explanation. Tension returns to the source that pulled away. Practical application doesn't require coldness or theatrical games. It requires rhythm control. Reduce initiative after moments of high connection. Don't respond immediately every single time. Not because you want to provoke, but because you don't need to be available all the time to sustain value. Silence here is not punishment. It is a pause. It is space. It is the interval that makes her mind return to you without you asking. When you understand this first effect, something changes internally. You stop using attention as a bargaining chip and start treating it as a valuable resource. The dynamic flips. Instead of you fighting for space in her mind starts returning to you. Not because you insisted, but because you went off the radar at the right moment. And that is the first sign that silence, when born from autonomy, doesn't push away. It calls. The second effect, her brain starts creating stories about you. When silence appears, the most common male impulse is to control it with explanations, long messages, unnecessary justifications, attempts to close the meaning of what happened. That mistake is born from discomfort with uncertainty. But the brain doesn't seek comfort in order to desire, it seeks meaning. And when meaning isn't delivered ready-made, it is built internally. That is the space where her mind begins working on its own. The neuroscientific basis is direct. The brain hates information gaps. When something is left unexplained, it tries to complete the picture by itself. Silence is not perceived as neutral emptiness, but as an open field for interpretation. An interpretation activates imagination, memory, and projection. Instead of distancing, rumination appears. The mind returns to your tone of voice, the last meeting, the bodily sensations associated with your presence. Silence becomes narrative. The expectation break here is clear. Silence creates projection, not immediate distancing. The more you explain, the less space you leave for her to build meaning. A University of Chicago study in 2014 showed that social ambiguity increases emotional rumination, especially in romantic contexts. The mind stays active trying to reduce uncertainty, and whatever keeps the mind active keeps desire alive. Practical application requires restraint. Don't emotionally close conversations. Don't turn absence into a speech. Don't explain silences as if you were apologizing for existing. Allow her to interpret your absence within the context you already built. Consistent presence before, silence after. That sequence matters. Without prior presence, silence becomes rejection. With real presence, silence becomes mystery. When you understand this second effect, you realize silence doesn't work outside. It works inside. You're not the one creating the stories, her brain is. And stories built internally have more force than any narrative you try to impose. The man who can tame that interval without justifying himself demonstrates something rare. He trusts his own value, and when value is felt, silence stops being a threat and becomes an invitation for imagination. If you understood what was explained so far, then you already see that silence is not empty absence. Silence is a tool of emotional leadership when there is presence behind it. Most men try to copy behavior without having internal structure, and that's why their silence sounds like insecurity, not value. What works is not disappearing. What works is sustaining presence, withdrawing at the right moment, and keeping control of your own rhythm without needing to justify anything. The code of seduction is complete training that teaches exactly this: how to use silence, presence, withdrawal, and emotional leadership. Based on real psychology, not games. It is a system that organizes your behavior into a clear mechanism where each pause has purpose. Each withdrawal communicates value, and each return increases emotional tension naturally. The training goes deeper into advanced techniques not taught openly on the internet. The link is in the description and in the pinned comment. The third effect, desire or rejection, depends on who you are. There comes a point where silence stops being a stimulus and becomes a diagnosis. It reveals who you are before any technique. Ignoring only works when there is previously perceived value. Without that, silence doesn't create curiosity. It creates emptiness. And emptiness without value is interpreted as rejection. This is where many men get lost because they try to use absence as a tool without having built presence. The result is not attraction, it is forgetfulness. The behavioral basis is simple and ruthless. Absence without value becomes rejection. The female brain doesn't react to silence and isolation. It reacts to the meaning of silence. If your prior presence left no mark, your absence doesn't create lack. It only confirms irrelevance. That's why the idea that ignoring always works is a trap. It's not silence that attracts. It's the silence of someone who doesn't need to stay to be validated. The expectation break here corrects a common mistake. Many believe disappearing creates value automatically. It doesn't. Value comes first. Silence only reveals it. Studies from the University of Minnesota in 2016 showed that people perceived as having options are evaluated as more attractive. Options communicate autonomy. Autonomy communicates internal security, and internal security completely changes how absence is read. The practical application requires the correct order. First, build real presence, autonomy, and direction. Be someone who decides, leads, and holds boundaries when present. Someone who doesn't mold himself to please, but creates memorable experiences when he shows up. Only after that does silence work as a natural consequence, not as a forced technique. When you step back in that context, absence communicates options, not neediness. When silence comes from a whole man, it doesn't sound like punishment or a game. It sounds like life happening. It communicates that you're not unavailable for lack of interest, but because you have too much access. That is the point where desire either activates or dies for good. And the difference isn't in what you do, it's in who you are when you decide not to stay. Conclusion: ignoring isn't a game, it's the power to withdraw. Deep down, everything comes down to a difference that separates needy men from whole men. Ignoring is not an external technique, it's an internal reflex. It only works when it comes from the real capacity not to depend. When silence isn't used to provoke a reaction, but emerges naturally from someone who doesn't sell himself emotionally to keep attention, it works. The man who ignores by strategy tries to control the other. The man who ignores by autonomy simply doesn't lose himself. Friedrich Nietzsche defined power as the ability not to depend, and that idea fits perfectly here. The female brain doesn't react to absence itself. It reacts to what that absence communicates. If it communicates neediness, it generates rejection. If it communicates options, it generates desire. When you can walk away without guilt, without anger, and without needing to explain, something shifts sides. Value stops being in the one who waits and becomes in the one who chooses. Ignoring doesn't work for men who need to be seen to feel valuable. It works for men who know who they are even when nobody's watching. Men who don't beg for replies, don't negotiate respect, and don't dissolve themselves to keep a connection. In those cases, silence doesn't hurt. It weighs, it creates space. It forces the other person to recalibrate the importance of that presence. When you understand this, you stop asking whether you should or shouldn't ignore a woman. The question changes. You start asking whether it's worth staying. And that internal shift changes the entire dynamic, because silence stops being a tool and becomes a natural consequence of someone who has life direction and his own axis. It's not about manipulating emotions. It's about not selling yourself emotionally. That is exactly what the code of seduction deepens. A complete system of female psychology, emotional magnetism, and male self-mastery focused on building presence, autonomy, and real withdrawal power. Advanced techniques that aren't in the common internet because they require maturity to apply. Access is in the link in the description and in the pinned comment. From here, the game is not ignoring or not ignoring. It is becoming the kind of man whose absence is felt because his presence was never optional. Silence, when used correctly, is not empty. It carries weight. Presence builds value, and absence, when timed right, amplifies it. The right man doesn't measure attention by responses received, but by the internal alignment of his own life. Every pause has a psychological effect. Every withdrawal creates mental space. Every return increases emotional tension naturally. The mechanism works because it aligns with neuroscience, not manipulation. The female brain reacts automatically to patterns of presence and absence. When attention disappears, curiosity arises. When patterns change, mental energy shifts inward. When the right man steps back, he doesn't seek drama. He allows the brain to do its work. Desire grows where it has room to emerge. Silence becomes the fertile ground for projection, imagination, and rumination. The man who masters this interval demonstrates emotional autonomy. He trusts his value. He doesn't chase approval or demand attention. He allows the dynamic to unfold naturally, letting the other mind catch up to what his presence has already communicated, that he is an option, not a necessity. Silence is not a threat, it's an invitation. When it comes from autonomy, it calls rather than repels. Her brain starts filling in gaps, creating stories, and returning focus to you. The effect is internal, unconscious, and far more powerful than any direct pursuit or message. When men panic and try to explain, justify, or close the gap with words, they remove the very space that fuels desire. The female brain doesn't need answers. It needs absence from which to construct meaning. Projection grows curiosity, imagination, and emotional attachment naturally. The more you explain, the less room there is for her mind to work. The more you chase, the less mental energy is allocated to your presence. Silence combined with prior connection turns absence into an active force. It makes her think, remember, and feel without your interference. Studies confirm this. Social ambiguity increases emotional rumination. Gaps in information demand resolution. Desire is maintained when the mind works to understand, reconstruct, and project. Absence, when paired with real value, triggers these mechanisms automatically. The practical application requires restraint and rhythm. Don't overreact, don't over-message, and never apologize for being unavailable. Allow the previous presence to carry weight. Silence should be natural, arising from autonomy, not insecurity or manipulation. Consistent presence first, silence after. Timing is everything. Without prior presence, absence becomes rejection. With presence, absence becomes mystery. Internal narratives emerge in her mind, giving your value force beyond what any direct communication could accomplish. The man who maintains his rhythm demonstrates self-mastery. He shows that he is not dependent on external validation. Silence is no longer a technique, but a consequence of being a whole man. Presence builds value, absence reveals it. Both must be aligned to be effective. When used correctly, the brain fills absence with curiosity and projection, rather than doubt and rejection. Desire is a result of perceived value, prior connection, and thoughtfully applied withdrawal. Absence alone, without presence or autonomy, creates emptiness, not attraction. Men who rely on silence as a tool without first building value fail. Silence reveals, it doesn't create. Absence only works if prior presence has demonstrated autonomy, competence, and emotional security. Otherwise, withdrawal signals irrelevance, not desire. Desire or rejection depends on the man's prior presence. Ignoring reveals character. Silence from a man